Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources.
This is the Forest Resources Committee podcast. I'm Andrew Kihn. This is our third episode in the series, Mill Closures and Workforce Shortages in the West. In the American West, few issues are quite so pressing as the vast and sweeping string of mill closures reshaping the forestry sector. In this episode, we are joined by Susan Jane Brown, principal of Silvix Resources, a nonprofit environmental law firm focused on advancing the conservation, restoration, and stewardship of Western public lands, and additionally vice president of the Blue Mountain Forest Partners, a regional stakeholder group committed to advancing resilience and well-being of forests and communities in the Blue Mountains. Susan Jane is a vice chair of the Forest Resources Committee and additionally teaches forest law and policy at Lewis and Clark Law School, where she has inspired many students, including myself, to pursue careers in the forest resources space. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
I'm excited for our conversation. I'll go ahead and jump right in. In our most recent episode, we spoke with Travis Joseph of the American Forest Resource Council, who provided us with a regional timber trade association perspective on the past year's mill closures in Oregon and beyond. As we will get to in greater detail momentarily, your work touches on the mill closures as well. Some of the principles that guide your work coincide with the AFRC. Others do not. As a point of entry, when you're thinking about the issues around mill closures and workforce challenges, what perspective are you approaching the problems from?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I approach these issues from a couple of different vantage points. The first being someone who has spent my career working on forestry issues, including working in rural communities where timber harvest and milling are a primary way of life. And when you spend time in communities actually talking to people who live there and spending time on the ground and seeing the ecological conditions that you're dealing with, as well as the socioeconomic ones, you start to have a different perspective than you might if you were not in those communities and didn't have those contact points or that experience. So for me, the way that I look at these things is there an ecological justification for proactive stewardship of these lands? And if so, what does that actually mean in terms of their actual stewardship? In many places, including the landscapes that I work in the Pacific Northwest, particularly the frequent fire forests of the Eastern Cascades and the Blue Mountains, those ecosystems really are quite degraded, mostly because of anthropomorphic policies that we have successfully implemented over the past number of decades, but which today we recognize are maladaptive to the ecological and socioeconomic settings out there. So what I've learned from that work is that there are a number of places, many places, where active management has a role to play. And so given that that is where the best available science, both Western and indigenous science, is leading us, then you've kind of come to the point where, okay, so active management is appropriate in a lot of these forests. How do we get that work done? So how do we support the restoration of the ecological integrity of those forests? And that just doesn't happen with a magic wand. You actually need workers and infrastructure, wood processing infrastructure, loggers, restoration contractors, prescribed burners. You need those people and the equipment that they require for their jobs in order to achieve those ecological outcomes. So for me, it goes together. It's an ecological question first, but followed quickly by a socioeconomic one. How do we achieve those ecological objectives? And for me, given my experience in these places, I think we need a viable wood products infrastructure and a workforce that can do that restoration work for us.
Thank you very much for that. I toggle back and forth between optimism and pessimism about the trajectory of forest health in this country and around the globe. And when I am feeling my most optimistic, it's because I really do think there's a growing consensus that ecological and community interests are advanced better together. And so it's very encouraging to hear your development towards that through the trajectory of your career. And I know coming into law school, I was very much of the mindset that we should keep every tree standing and any tree fallen is a loss. But I have really been reshaping my perspective in the past few years, in no small part to your class, your mentorship.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I had a similar evolution in my own career when I started law school. I started law school in the mid 90s in the Pacific Northwest, and that was at the height of the timber wars. And I thought that we should do all that we can do to stop the rapacious, mismanagement of our forests. And over time, I've learned that that is really not how these forests are managed, nor is it how they should be managed. And a lot has changed, in the past 30 years. And I don't think that the public really fully understands those shifts and those changes, both socioeconomically, but also in the profession of forest management. So I think it's good that we all question these closely held views and are open to changing them based on new information, new experiences, and different points of view that we may come in contact with. So it's good that we're now starting to have these conversations about how these lands should be managed and what kind of socioeconomic support system they're going to need if we want those ecological outcomes or ecosystem services to flow from those lands themselves.
Turning now to the theme of this series, as we alluded to, presently you're working on a pending closure of the Malheur lumber sawmill in Grant County, Oregon, with potentially grave regional consequences should the closure go through. Some major aspects of this potential closure are unique, but many of the underpinning pressures that have given rise to the present situation are characteristic of the mill closures we have seen this year across Oregon and the West, particularly those issues related to the workforce. Briefly, could you outline for us what's going on there?
Sure. This is a situation that is affecting the West and its small rural communities, particularly those that are closely associated with public lands management, whether that's forestry or range or even mineral development. My area of expertise, my touch point is the forest management realm. And what I have seen over the past really couple of years, it's been the past 3 or 4 years so post pandemic, where what's going on in these rural communities is changing. And what I have seen and what I've heard from others who are similarly situated in other rural communities across the West is a couple of things. One, the continued mechanization of the wood processing profession. It used to be that if you were out there harvesting a stand of trees, it would take you 10 to 15 guys plus a bunch of chainsaws and axes and trucks to get that finished product, or at least that severed tree, out of the woods and over to the mill. And then once it gets to the mill, it would take another, several dozen people to actually process that into a 2x4. And today, that's no longer the case. The equipment that your average logger uses is much more sophisticated and efficient than it was back in even the 60s or 70s. Same thing for those infrastructure facilities. So mills themselves have generally retooled to take smaller diameter trees and to do a more efficient job of producing a finished product at the end of the day. So that mechanization and development continues apace. We have more efficient equipment than we did back in the day. And so with that comes changes in workforce. And as that mechanization has changed, so has the type of person or the number of people that are needed to run the equipment. And that has had further changes brought on top of that from, frankly, I guess I would say, the unraveling of the social fabric in rural communities. It used to be that you'd have a small rural community full of families that had lived there for many generations and had a stable, good paying job either at the mill or running the family ranch. And the younger generation saw that as a viable career pathway, that there was really no reason to leave the community to find either a profession or a family or friends. Everything you needed was in that community, and was really, there's no reason to look further than that. Today, however, you've got a situation where kids don't want to stay at home on the family ranch. They know everyone that they went to elementary school and middle school and high school with, and they don't really want to start a family with those folks. They want to meet new and different people. And in order to do that, they need to leave their community, or they no longer see the viability of working on the ranch or working in the woods because those jobs are no longer as financially rewarding as they used to be. It's more expensive to do those kinds of jobs. And so you're seeing communities drain their youth and not come back. They go to the cities, they maybe get a degree from a 2-year or 4-year institution and have no interest in returning home to work in the woods. So we've lost the younger generations that see a viable career pathway in those rural communities. And without that younger generation, you have no workforce to draw from. And so what we've seen in Grant County, where Malheur Lumber Company is trying to keep their mill open, we simply don't have the younger workforce to draw from. And so you're looking at retaining an older workforce, which those folks may have some great institutional knowledge about how to pull green chain in the mill, but they may not be physically fit enough, for example, to do that work anymore. And it's become increasingly difficult to find workers who are able to pass drug tests, for example, whether that's fentanyl or marijuana. If you want to work for a mill, more than likely you're going to have to be able to pass a drug test because more than likely those businesses do business with the federal government. And that is a requirement of doing business with the federal government, is that you have a drug-free workforce. So those issues, the difficulty in finding able-bodied workers that want to stay in the community and can afford to work for the wages that are being paid, and a drug-free workforce, those challenges have become existential threats for a lot of rural communities. The communities are just simply getting older and don't have the workforce that we need to do the work in the woods or the work in the mills or drive the trucks that we need to make the restoration economy go. And that's really the primary struggle that Malheur Lumber has been facing over the past couple of months that led to their announcement that they were going to close their doors.
Thank you very much for painting that picture so clearly. So many of those issues are made extra tricky because they compound. In our first episode, we spoke with Jesse Wade, an economist from the National Association of Home Builders, and touched on the particularly ironic challenge of a lack of available housing around these mills for a workforce to attractively retain workforces when, of course, you need lumber mill to build homes. So jumping into what is the hard question at the center of this series, how do we address these problems? What legal and policy changes do you want to see made to keep the mills, like the Malheur Lumber, operational and to help develop and maintain a workforce that can run them? Or are these even the right goals to have?
Those are some good questions. And I think they're the right questions to be asking. And a related question to be asking is, what is the federal government's role in stewarding federal public lands? How far does that obligation extend? Obviously, these are public lands. They're owned by all Americans. We have a whole suite of federal environmental laws that dictate their management. Those are all things that I really appreciate. I really like quite a bit. However, in the past probably 40 years or so, the Forest Service, I think in particular, and the Forest Service manages our national forest. There's 193 million acres of national forest lands throughout our country, in addition to lands that the Bureau of Land Management manages, which are less likely to be forested than national forests. So the main agency, the Forest Service, that manages those lands has really moved away from seeing itself as an integral part of a local community. I think they see themselves more as a business with a job to do, as opposed to a valued local community member with a major role to play in terms of how lands are stewarded and the role that people play, that humans play in that management. And that shift happened for a lot of reasons, including fear of agency capture, which was real in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. but I think is no longer really truly the case because of the way in which the Forest Service manages its personnel. And it moves its personnel around very, very regularly to the point where there, in my view, isn't a lot of institutional knowledge on any given national forest by the Forest Service staff who run that forest. They're not very familiar with the local ecology. They're probably not familiar with the local movers and shakers in that community, any of the baggage that comes with a small rural community with lots of people wearing lots of hats over many generations. There's baggage that comes with that. But if you don't know that kind of information, it's pretty hard to show up as a interested and engaged member of that community. So I think the Forest Service has really gotten away from that. And as such, has kind of lost its vision for how to manage lands in a way that certainly is true to the ecology of an area, but also does serve the socioeconomic interests of those communities as well. And so I would like to see the agency get back to that, which is not to say that unfettered logging is the answer or unfettered grazing or mineral development is the answer. That's definitely not the answer in my view. Rather, it's an idea around how do we make these communities associated with this chunk of public lands, how do we make sure that those communities are viable? And so that includes things like workforce development programs. There's a lot of federal capacity and resources around economic development. How do we bring those resources to bear in John Day or Baker City or Burns or anywhere else in the West for that matter? How do we ensure that the folks in those communities have access to that capacity? And that is a challenge that we have not figured out really how to land yet. There are other associated issues, and you pointed one out in terms of housing availability. That's also a problem that we have in Grant County, where it's an older community. Most people who live there have lived there for a while and have lived in their home for a long period of time. And so there's pretty low housing stock or housing availability. So if you're a new employee at the Forest Service and maybe you're a young family, you can't even find an affordable place to live or daycare for your kids. And if we can't find workers or housing or daycare, those are some pretty basic social fabric kinds of things. And if we can't provide those in rural communities, then we really have no hope of attracting and retaining a workforce, whether that's to work in the mill or to work at a new business startup or to run cows, whatever it happens to be. We need to have all of those sort of benchmark or baseline conditions and infrastructure and resources present. And the fact of the matter is that most of our rural communities are missing those opportunities. And I recognize that sometimes that's by choice. There are rural communities that really don't want help from anybody. And they're happy with the way things are and really don't see a need for change. And that's fine. Those kinds of things should be determined by the people who live there. But in other communities like John Day, there is an interest in making sure that that community stays viable and that people have working class jobs and that folks can stay in the community if they want to and buy a new home if they want to. And those are the kinds of things that I think that government should be better at assisting with. And frankly, we're just not very good at it.
Thank you for that hard questions and pretty concrete solutions to go along with them, which is not easy to do. Since you closed that question on government and Forest Service and their role in it was sprinkled throughout, I think it would be a good time to ask you about the recent election, which is something I've asked every guest on this show so far. When you're thinking about mill closures and the workforce issues we've been discussing, how do you see them evolving under this incoming administration? What are the biggest fears and hopes that you have concerning federal policy, federal management in this space through the next 4 years and beyond?
I think that's the trillion-dollar question. And I guess I would answer that in a couple different ways. One, the incoming administration has not said a whole lot about anything related to natural resources or public lands. And so we don't really have a lot to go on to try to figure out what we might see in the next 4 years. I hear a lot about working class Americans. I hear a little bit about rural America, but I don't see anything about how we ensure that rural America gets a fair shake. And what I hear mostly about is draining the swamp and reducing the size of government. I can definitely appreciate that. On the other hand, when you talk about rural America and the needs of those communities, the brutal truth is that a lot of those communities are dependent on the lifeline of federal government grants or subsidies or payments. And without those kinds of payments or subsidies or financing, most of the services that anybody wants, including those in rural communities, are going to dry up. And so when I hear claims about reducing the size of government, that's great in the abstract. But I don't think people are really going to like that when it comes to the cost of gas or the price of eggs or whether or not we have a forest service that can develop and put up for sale timber sales on national forest lands. So I worry that the zeal around reducing the size of government is going to go too far, and there won't be any government at all to deliver the services that these communities and I think all Americans ultimately want to see. So I worry a lot about that. The other thing that I worry about is similar to that, which is the interest in repealing or replacing or dramatically limiting the reach of federal environmental laws that, like them or not, kind of make the world go round. So when we're talking about federal land management, there are a whole host of laws that direct and dictate how that happens. And there's a lot of interest in getting rid of red tape, whatever that means. And I think when you talk about that, and if you follow it to its logical conclusion, which is the repeal of a lot of those laws, which again may sound great if your ultimate goal is reducing the number of laws that are on the books, the problem is that that creates quite a bit of chaos. And the chaos that would result from the elimination or the dramatic curtailment of the federal regulatory and statutory schemes that dictate how our federal lands are managed may feel good on the part of the new administration, but ultimately will be a huge disservice to those communities that the administration says it intends to serve. So if you get rid of environmental laws, you don't leave a lot of opportunity for dissenting points of view. And without that outlet, I think that the ultimate conclusion is chaos and anarchy. And that's not what anybody wants. What we all want is predictability and certainty. And that comes with a solid legal framework that everybody knows what it is and how the rules of the game are played. And I worry that that legal certainty will be upended in the new administration.
Thank you very much for that answer as well. Another tough one. To close, I'll stick with the theme of hard questions and ask what I think is the hardest question of them all in this space, at least for me, as I'm stepping into it. Within the community of folks that count themselves as conservationists, and I would put myself among them, there's a broad continuum of views pro-offered as the best practice for forest resource management, spanning from what we've sort of discussed, highly active, free market-oriented, logging-centric approaches to completely passive, logging-free ones, where we try and leave the wilderness out on its own. Forest science can be a guiding light, but relying on the science alone can often lose sight of the interests of the local stakeholders in forest lands. So I know we touched on this some at the beginning, but I'm hoping to hear in your career, both in taking on the mill closure issue and more broadly in promoting the health of Western public lands, how do you navigate those rifts between what's best for the health of the forests and the vitality of the communities that are most connected to those forest lands?
Yes, a series of tough questions. The way that I would answer that question is that I agree that science can only be a guide. It can tell you a lot of things because science is a methodology to test hypotheses. And so if you have a hypothesis and you've got a rigorous scientific process associated with it, you can employ science. You can science that thing and you can come up with an answer that science will give you. But it is still just an answer that science has given you. And it is not necessarily reflective of people. And so for me, forest management is not so much a technical question because there's a lot of science out there these days, Western and indigenous knowledge, that the weight of that information, of that science, really is pointing us in a particular direction around proactive stewardship in a lot of our forests, particularly the fire-dependent forests of the West. Other forests, like the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest on the west side of the Cascades, need a lot less active management simply because they aren't out of whack. And the science tells us that. So following the science is certainly a best practice, but ultimately this is a social question. And what does society want out of these forests? And I think the way to answer that question is in a localized, place-based setting. So I frequently turn to forest collaboratives like the Blue Mountains Forest Partners that I've been working with for more than 20 years now. That's a local stakeholder group. It's very diverse. We've got conservation interests, elected officials, timber industry, prescribed fire practitioners, ranchers, ordinary citizens. We've got all kinds of people in that collaborative. And we do not all agree on all of the things by any means, but it is a safe space informed by science to have socially driven conversations about how we want to manage these lands together, recognizing that they're public lands. So we all get a say in how those lands are managed. When you devolve decision-making, not without some sideboards, which I believe our federal environmental laws provide, but you provide those sideboards in a place where local people can figure out what works for them based on the science, which they can totally reject if they don't like that. They don't like what the science is telling them. And sometimes we do that. Sometimes we don't like the answers that science is telling us. Eventually, we're going to have to wrestle with those answers that science is telling us, but we don't have to follow them because that's a social decision. We decide what we want to do and how far we want to take the science in a social setting. And I think the forest collaboratives are a good way to do that, to have those honest, difficult, but real conversations. So the more that we can have sort of these difficult, big picture conversations in a local setting, I think it really helps to ground the discussion. And it helps people get their arms around difficult questions around ecology, around economics, around workforce. It allows them to have those conversations in a local setting where things make a little bit more sense and where you can really name and identify the problems to be solved and then to work together to solve those problems. And you're probably going to need help from people who are not at your table. And that's why we have networks and that's why we have friends, so that when we diagnose the actual problems to be solved and start to develop the solutions to address those problems, we can really do so in a comprehensive way that's not myopic and that actually gets to the root causes of some of the social, economic, and ecological distress that we're seeing centralized around our rural communities that are natural resource dependent.
Thank you for taking that on. I think lessons can be drawn from Blue Mountain Forest Partners and other collaborative efforts across the space and far beyond, deep into the political discourse and divide in this country today. Well, Professor, thank you very kindly for your time and insights today. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we log off?
I think that this is a really good conversation, and I hope that more lawyers and people in the legal profession, practitioners. I'm a litigating attorney. I also do policy issues. I also sit at the collaborative table. But I think the more that lawyers can really lean into the perhaps non-legal aspects of their practice, but bringing that legal expertise to local communities that are struggling with challenges like this and provide that insight and expertise. I think the more we can do that as legal professionals, the better. It's generally not something that, and I can say this as a professor, at least adjunct professor at a law school, I don't think law schools do a really good job of teaching students how to do community lawyering. I think we teach students how to shepherdize cases and to maybe, if you're lucky, draft a complaint. But I don't think we do a really good job about instructing or helping students understand how to bring all of their legal instruction together to really better address social challenges. Doesn't mean you're not going to be in the courtroom. I'm in the courtroom, but I'm also trying to solve real problems for real people on the ground where those problems originate. And I think lawyers have a real opportunity to do better in that space. So I hope by having conversations like this, where we're talking about legal issues, but also really socioeconomic challenges that derive from those legal challenges, I think the better. I think that just makes us a better advocacy community and more informed practitioners.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.
The Forest Resources Committee podcast is presented by the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. A special thanks to Connor Carlin and Carolyn Gilbert for editorial support. I'm Andrew Kihn, and we'll see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.